I recommend member for Oak Bay Golden Head.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise, not to speak in support, but to speak in opposition to the motion we have before us. As I mentioned yesterday, the TPP is fundamentally bad for British Columbians. The TPP, Honourable Speaker, was signed by 12 Pacific nations: Australia, Brunei Darussalam, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, United States, Singapore, and Vietnam in New Zealand on February the 3rd, 2016. Honourable Speaker, we heard a lot about trade agreements with China and South Korea yesterday from members opposite, but this has nothing to do with trade agreements with China, South Korea, India, or others, despite what members opposite might think. But that, Honourable Speaker, takes us to the point that this motion was brought to us and the legislature before the text of the TPP was even available. How cynical is that, Honourable Speaker? How cynical is it for a government to make its mind up on an agreement that it has not even got the text of to determine whether or not they support the agreement? It's very cynical. And we know, Honourable Speaker, in this legislature, we know the singular reason that they're bringing the motion forward now is because they're trying to make hay on the fact that the federal NDP passed support for looking at the LEAP manifesto. And it was rather an odd decision, mind you, but they passed support to go forward with that and study it for 2 years. And this is a good opportunity that government can take to actually make hay by trying to make the official opposition look bad in a substanceless debate, a debate that stoops to such levels as discussing what will happen to food security when we have outbreaks of disease and pestilence and world war. Can you believe this, that the Minister of Agriculture is arguing for TPP, that we need to enter into free trade agreements, which have indemnity clauses in there, Honourable Speaker, that protect the rights of multinational corporations over the rights of the British Columbians and Canadians, that we somehow should sign this agreement in case World War breaks out. You can't make this stuff up, Honourable Speaker. Not only does it not make sense, but if this agreement were signed and war broke out, according to the agreement, we'd be liable to ensure that food still went elsewhere. It's exactly the opposite, which shows me, Honourable Speaker, clearly how intently and intensely members of government have actually looked at the agreement. I don't think they have. Well, I know that they haven't. Honourable Speaker, I'm willing to wager that if there is one person in this legislature who's actually, if there's one person in this House who's actually read the agreement, it is the member from Surrey Whalley. Nobody else, including me, has read all 6,000 pages. I've read a bunch of the pages, but not 6,000. I just, Honourable Speaker, again, as identified just there in the heckle, someone or two from members opposite said, "Are you sure you read 6,000?" After I just said, I didn't read all 6,000. This shows exactly, Honourable Speaker, the level of understanding this government has to the actual document before us. The TPP, as I outlined, contains investor-state provisions that give foreign corporations, an investor, so-called, the ability to sue Canadian government, the so-called state, in secret tribunals over any legislation which would hurt their profits further, such as regulations defending human health, labor safety, or the environment. So in case we have world war breaking out and we want to protect our agri-food industry for local consumption, in fact, we can't, despite what the Minister of Agriculture might say. Now, Honourable Speaker, we have some high-profile cases under NAFTA, an agreement where rulings have gone against Canada because of unfair restrictions. I could, for example, talk about the arbitration panel ruling against Canada after a U.S. company argued a joint federal-provincial environmental review board decision to disallow a quarry in the small fishing community of Digby Neck. Nova Scotia imposed unfair trade sanctions. The US company is now seeking $300 million in damages. We've got another NAFTA panel recently ordered Canada to pay ExxonMobil Corporation and Murphy Oil $17.3 million after Newfoundland and Labrador required offshore oil producers to have money allocated to research. We've got TransCanada, a Canadian example, behind Keystone XL, launching a $15 billion lawsuit against US under NAFTA. Now, in and of itself, these are examples. But what we have under NAFTA, of course, is the ability as a nation to withdraw from NAFTA with appropriate notice. PPP, we're signing away our life and future generations as the substance of exit clauses is unknown. Honourable Speaker, I come back to the Tufts University report that I cited yesterday. And why I thought that was important to come back to it is I want to touch upon the conclusions of this report, which fundamentally underline why this is a bad agreement for British Columbia. And it says as following: in the main existing assessment, the TPP is projected to generate small gains in GDP in most participating economies. However, these projections are based on an economic model that assumes full employment and invariant income distribution, thereby excluding from the outset some of the most serious risks of trade liberalization. Honourable Speaker, as I mentioned yesterday, I gave an example of the assumption using cars. The fact that this model that was used to make one or two, the models that the government's relying on, assumes full employment. Full employment is a poor assumption in a trade deal that's talking about the creation of jobs, when in fact, when more realistic assumptions are used, the TPP is projected to cause 58,000 job losses in Canada. Not job gains, job losses. Because full employment is not guaranteed, because a company will not just pay workers lower and lower amounts, they'll move elsewhere and shut the factory down. The concluding remarks continue. Projecting the effects of the TPP with a different economic model based on the realistic assumptions about economic adjustment and income distribution leads to different results. We project that the TPP will lead to contraction of the GDP in the United States and in Japan, and negligible income gains in other countries. One of the reasons why the US is actually talking about not ratifying this agreement. They're not talking about not ratifying this agreement because the agreement actually will lead to a contraction in US GDP. We also project job losses, it says, and higher inequality in all participating economies. That includes BC. In the face of negligible or negative income gains, the costs of the TPP are projected to fall asymmetrically on labor. Furthermore, it says, when analyzed with a model that recognizes the risks of trade liberalization, the TPP appears to only marginally change competitiveness among participating countries. Most gains are therefore obtained at the expense of non-TPP countries. And it says, finally, globally, the TPP favors competition on labor costs and remuneration of capital. Let me reiterate that, please, Honourable Speaker. The TPP favors competition on labor costs. So how do we translate that into the Canadian economy? How do we reconcile with that with the projected 58,000 job losses in Canada? It's quite simple. As I said again, TPP favors competition on labor costs. Declining labor costs is not going to benefit British Columbians. It's not going to benefit Canadians. And the reason why is clear. We have a certain standard of living here in British Columbia that we ensure with minimum wages, benefits, etc., that people who work here enjoy. Now, if I'm going to dig up a mine somewhere, I'm going to consider one of the following. Should I go into British Columbia and make a mine here where we have an expectation of environmental standards being met? We have an expectation that we're going to have to work in partnership with First Nations. We have an expectation that we're going to have to pay union wages. Or should I open up a mine now in Indonesia, which is well known for far less stringent environmental concerns, paying far cheaper wages, and also geologic formations that match British Columbians and elsewhere? The choice is quite simple for a multinational corporation that is beholden to shareholders that are not residents of the region that you're employing, but are globally around the world, some of whom have interesting Panama bank accounts. When you are accountable to your shareholder, you are, in essence, without any internalizing of social or environmental costs, trying to race to the bottom, you are looking for the cheapest way of digging that rock out of the ground and bringing it to market. And the cheapest way means the non-BC way. The cheapest way means the non-Canadian way. The cheapest way means finds the most despot nation in the world that has zero environmental standards, no labor standards, and build your mine there because your costs of doing it are minimal. And that is why, Honourable Speaker, that is why the TPP will create job losses in Canada. I cannot believe that member after member opposite stood up and blindly said, this is going to create job opportunities for British Columbia. I don't think they've even read the analysis of the TPP. Frankly, I don't think they know what the TPP is. Let me give some more examples, Honourable Speaker. Now, Michael Geist, the chair in Internet and E-commerce at the law at the University of British Columbia, took a 50-day analysis of the TPP. Every day he was putting something else out. You know, I'm not going to read all 50 of them because we'd be here all day. They are fascinating. They are insightful. But let me just outline some of the critiques for members opposite. The first one was that Canada was at a negotiating disadvantage from the start because Canada was a latecomer to the agreement and had to plead to get in and gave concessions to get in, particularly with copyright and other laws. Intellectual property rules lack balance, according to Mr. Geist. Copyright costs, term extension, criminal liability, and digital locks are of concern. The TPP copyright provisions, he said, will require significant changes to Canadian law and limit Canada's ability to implement future reforms. Does that sound like a benefit for British Columbia? I'm not so confident. More IP changes, patents, trademarks, trade secrets, and geographic indicators is another area of concern. And here he says the concerns with the TPP's intellectual property chapter extend well beyond copyright. Talks about patent and term adjustment rules. He talks about protection for the next generation of pharmaceuticals. You know, this is certainly to the benefit of multinational corporations looking to maximize profits for the wealthy few, and certainly not in the interest of the workers in the factories producing these products. He talks about the risk of privacy risk. I'll come back to that. He talks about, which I'm going to expand upon for most of the rest of my time here, how this is a step backward for the internet and technology. Now, Honourable Speaker, before I go into that cost, let me just say that there's risks. He argues about risks from investor-state dispute settlement provisions, health costs and regulation risks, and restrictions on Canadian cultural policy. Now let's come back to the tech issue. Now we all know in British Columbia that nobody thought this government was going to become elected in 2013. Nobody, including government themselves. So they dreamed up a strategy, an LNG strategy. An LNG strategy that was selling a bill of goods to Canadians. We're going to have a $1 trillion increase in GDP, $100 billion prosperity fund, 100,000 jobs, debt-free BC, thriving schools and hospitals. Wow, who would not want to vote for that? But, Honourable Speaker, it was nothing more than fiction. A fictional dream offered to British Columbians as a form of a Hail Mary pass of hope that was caught because British Columbians believed, shame on them for believing the government. Clearly the evidence is that we should not believe what the government is saying. They believed them, and they ticked the wrong box. The wrong box, and a few too many of them got elected through you, Honourable Speaker, them being the collective BC Liberals. And here we are in a situation where we have a reckless management of our province, reckless economics trajectory of our province, and a government that now realizes it can't deliver on LNG. And what it's not saying, Honourable Speaker, While it's trying to actually pin the NDP as being anti-trade deals, what they're not saying, and it's really interesting if you go through Hansard and look, they're not saying another one of the key reasons why they like this agreement. It's because they're desperate to deliver on Petronas, a company based in Malaysia, a signatory of TPP, reducing investment in infrastructure, likely not going to go anywhere in northern British Columbia. It doesn't have a supply gap to fill anytime soon. They're desperate. Give it away some more. Let's just send them a signal that TPP is actually going to be good for us, because then it's actually good for Petronas. Honourable Speaker, nobody mentioned Petronas yesterday in the speech. They talked about agri-foods. They talked about cattle. They talked about sparkling wine. Okay, it may benefit the sparkling wine industry. But who they didn't talk about, who it really benefits, are people like Petronas, the multinational based in other jurisdictions that's chasing to the bottom to try to develop a resource. The economics doesn't even work, but this is them trying to desperately give away a resource to say that look, listen to us, we're here. We've done what we said we'd do. Honourable Speaker, what's so ironic about this is in their fiscal folly over the last 3 years, what we have now in British Columbia are not natural gas plays anymore. We have legal plays now. Not natural gas plays, but legal plays. Companies investing in LNG in British Columbia are now seeing legal opportunities for settlements because of the reckless promises of this government and the inability to deliver to a market. So these are now becoming legal plays. Honourable Speaker, and at what cost? The tech sector will be devastated by the TPP. And I raise natural gas only because we see from government, as of last August, when they recognized, oops, LNG's going nowhere, staff were suddenly told, you better hold a tech conference in Vancouver in January, and they scurried to hold a big tech conference to celebrate tech, a sector they've essentially given up on, left fall by the wayside for years. A clean tech sector that they've killed through the construction of Site C and a signal to market that it's all about LNG or nothing in BC. They created this tech conference, but they don't understand the tech sector, Honourable Speaker. They don't understand the tech sector because TPP is bad for the tech sector. Let me give you some examples. More than 250 tech companies signed a letter demanding greater transparency from Congress back last year. They were decrying the broad regulatory language in leaked parts at the time of the TPP trade deal, the deal that was signed in secrecy. 250 tech companies in the US. Honourable Speaker, coming back to Mr. David Wolf, let me summarize what he said in the Globe and Mail a few weeks back. In fact, the actual date was March the 26th of this year, so just a couple of weeks back. He said this: Canada's problems are compounded by the bias against technology-based industries that exists in small, open economies. The barriers to entry associated with technological innovation disadvantage smaller firms to a greater extent than larger ones. At the same time, the domestic market does not provide an ecosystem for them to scale up. To the extent that these economies are home to a greater proportion of small Indigenous firms, the entire economy is placed at a disadvantage with respect to competition in high technology industries. The public incentive to support those firms that compete in technologically intensive sectors is much greater for a small open economy than for a larger one. Transforming the research and design base of firms in this economy and ensuring protection of their knowledge base is necessary for effective competition in the 21st century. Honourable Speaker, Jim Balsillie, from the former co-founder of Research in Motion, producer of Blackberries, he said something about TPP that expands upon the words that I just read from Mr. David Wolf. What Mr. Balsillie pointed out is as follows: TPP raises the minimum global IP standards of the World Trade Organizations by extending and enforcing the US IP regime and interest to all TPP countries. Make no mistake, he says, this is not your father's trade agreement. TPP clearly demarks the shift in global value creation from tangible to intangible goods by providing unprecedented advantages to current large holders and producers of IP. This fellow should know what he's talking about because, Honourable Speaker, as I'll show in a second, his company was one of only a few such 300 top organizations that granted US patents. How many Amazons are in BC, in Canada, with central offices? How many eBays? How many of the global multinational corporations are based in BC? We have Hootsuite struggling along. BC has created an environment where companies get so big and then they move to the US. But now with TPP, it will cripple even that incubator component of the tech sector in British Columbia. Coming back to what Jim Balsillie said, Canada does not have the arsenal of valuable IP to benefit financially from such provisions. The Intellectual Property Owners Association's most recent ranking of top 300 organizations granted US patents lists BlackBerry as the only Canadian entry. In their top 100 worldwide universities granted US utility patents, UBC was the only Canadian university listed at 78th place with 29 patents granted, compared with the University of California's 453. Canadians create world-class innovations, he says, but we fail to commercialize them. A recent Conference Board of Canada innovation report ranks Canada second to last on the ability to patent our ideas, a core aspect of ideas commercialization. With so few Canadian companies and universities positioned to benefit from TPP's IP provisions, we are ill prepared to compete with countries possessing hundreds of such wealth-generating entities. That's from somebody who should know, Honourable Speaker, Jim Balsillie, former co-founder of RIM, based in Waterloo. Honourable Speaker, it goes on. We have here another quote that says the following. This is from a law professor. The law professor in this particular case is Michael Geist again, an expert on international internet legal issues. If things don't go Canada's way, he says in a CBC News piece on August of last year, and on a lot of issues that Canada is playing defense, is in the minority, then it's going to require a major overhaul of our copyright law, he said. He further said, and the article states, Geist said a section of the draft text could even require Canadian internet service providers to block access to websites that contain copyright infringing material in response to court orders from somewhere else in the world. And he said this, it's something the government has consistently rejected through copyright reform process. Honourable Speaker, it goes on and on. He talks about the fact that this is a made in America point. And he says that when you look at the digital policies, things like copyright, intellectual policy, privacy rules, internet, and internet governance rules, there's some real harms that we find in this agreement. This is not good for BC's tech sector. And finally, Honourable Speaker, on another topic of great concern, is the issue of privacy. Now, the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, FIPA, has raised concern, as pointed out in a Business Vancouver piece, that TPP provisions could override BC law governing data storage. And it's not just the FIPA that's pointed out, it's others as well, as I'll come to. And in quoting this article in Business Vancouver by Tyler Orton, published back in November of 2015, it says the following, Victoria enacted laws requiring sensitive data to be kept within Canada after concerns arose in 2004 that BC health data could be subject to the US Patriot Act if stored outside the country. The TPP, however, states governments cannot require companies to use servers within their own borders as a condition of conducting business. To be very, very clear on this, Honourable Speaker, Article 14.13 of the TPP establishes a restriction on legal requirements to do so. Here is the quote, "No party shall require a covered person to use or locate computing facilities in that party's territories as a condition for conducting business in that territory," Honourable Speaker. We blindly walk into this agreement. We blindly walk into this agreement in a cynical ploy to try to pin the NDP in British Columbia to their federal counterparts who enacted a study for 2 years about the LEAP manifesto. Counterparts, I recognize it's the same party, but in their defense, there was not a single member of this party in this House on the Sunday on the floor. Did I say counterpoints? Well, the Minister from Advanced Education, he so dutifully corrects me, and I am so very grateful for being corrected here as to using the word counterpoint to counterpart. Thank you, Honourable Minister of Advanced Education. It's such the appropriate ministry, too, the advanced education. I've been relegated to an A-. I had one A-, Honourable Minister, when I was an undergraduate. Only one in my times as an undergraduate, and now I've got my second. I got a lot of A+, Honourable Speaker. We have not lots of times. I'd be happy to share my undergraduate transcript with you. I did graduate with an 8.95 GPA, not a 9. I was crushed, Honourable Speaker. I got that one A-, and my GPA was 8.95, not 9. Okay. The members opposite, we're having an ego battle back and forth, Honourable Speaker. But he got the Rhodes Scholarship, Honourable Speaker. I did not. I only got to the interview stage. The member opposite actually got the Rhodes Scholar. So, anyway, I digress. So finally, Honourable Speaker. You have a counterpoint? Finally, Honourable Speaker. I've just been completely had my legs cut out for me from the Minister of Advanced Education in this debate. He wins, sorry. Honourable Speaker, in conclusion, this deal is a bad deal for British Columbia. This deal is a bad deal for Canadians. This motion should not pass, and this government should be ashamed of itself for bringing this cynical motion forward at a time that they hadn't even got the agreement to actually explore the details of. Thank you.